They called the Atlantic theirs, an ocean ruled by iron discipline and Teutonic precision. Yet in the frozen winter of 1943, Grand Admiral Heinrich Wolff stood in the war room beneath Berlin, staring at a map that no longer made sense. Red pins multiplied like a plague across every sea lane, every convoy route, every supposed safe passage. Each pin marked a kill. Each kill bore the signature of American submarines. Wolff's hand trembled as he traced the impossible pattern. How could the Americans, those industrial amateurs who barely knew how to build a proper warship 3 years ago, now have vessels lurking in waters the Kriegsmarine considered sovereign? His aide whispered the count: 47 German ships sunk in 30 days, not by fleets, not by aircraft, but by submarines that appeared from nowhere, struck with surgical violence, then vanished like ghosts into the depths. The question that haunted every German naval commander was no longer if they would encounter an American, but when and whether they would survive to report it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year 1942 had belonged to Germany. The U-boats, sleek wolves of the deep, prowled the Atlantic with murderous efficiency. Operation Drumbeat had turned the American coastline into a shooting gallery. Tankers burned like floating pyres within sight of Florida beaches. Merchant ships cracked in half off Cape Hatteras, spilling cargo and lives into dark waters. The Americans seemed helpless, their convoys scattered prey for hunters who owned the night. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz had promised total victory through the U-boat arm alone, and for months, it seemed he would deliver. The tonnage figures told a story of dominance, hundreds of thousands of tons sent to the bottom each month, supply lines severed, Britain strangled. German submariners became celebrities, their commanders awarded Knight's Crosses, their exploits celebrated in newsreels across the Reich. The ocean had become a German lake, and the Americans were merely swimming in it. But empires built on arrogance carry the seeds of their own unraveling. While Germany celebrated its undersea dominance, America was learning, not slowly, not cautiously, but with the furious energy of an industrial titan that had been bloodied and now sought vengeance. Shipyards that had built cargo vessels retooled for war. Engineers who designed cars turned their minds to submarines. The Americans did not simply copy German designs, they reimagined what a submarine could be. They built boats longer, faster, deeper diving. They equipped them with radar that could see through darkness, sonar that could hear a convoy 50 miles distant, and torpedoes guided by technology the Germans had dismissed as fantasy. Most crucially, they built them in numbers that defied comprehension. Where Germany might launch 1 U-boat, America launched 5 fleet submarines in the same week. The Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, became a factory of submerged death, turning out Gatto-class boats like automobiles rolling off an assembly line. By early 1943, the tide had turned, though the Germans did not yet realize the depth of their miscalculation. American submarines began appearing not just in the Atlantic, but in every ocean Germany considered accessible. They lurked off the coast of Norway, intercepting iron ore shipments from Sweden. They prowled the Mediterranean, turning supply runs to North Africa into suicide missions. Most devastatingly, they penetrated the Far East, where German blockade runners attempted to carry critical raw materials from Japan back to the Reich. These were not the clumsy, desperate actions of a learning navy. These were coordinated, precise, relentless operations conducted by crews who had studied every mistake, absorbed every lesson, and emerged as masters of undersea warfare. Commander Jacob Steiner was among the first to understand what was happening. A veteran of 30 patrols aboard U-boats, he had transitioned to surface command of the armed merchant cruiser Rheingold, a converted freighter tasked with running rubber and tungsten from Japanese-held ports back to Germany. Steiner was no fool. He knew the route around the Cape of Good Hope was suicide. He chose instead the Arctic Passage, a frozen hell that most submarines avoided. The cold made sonar unreliable, icebergs appeared on detection gear as phantom contacts, and the weather could kill a crew faster than any torpedo. Steiner believed the Americans would never venture into such misery for a single target. He was wrong. 3 days north of the Falklands, in seas so cold that spray froze on contact with metal, Rheingold detected a shadow on her radar. It was fleeting, there for one sweep, gone the next. Steiner's radar operator, a sharp-eyed young man named Otto Brenner, insisted it was real. Steiner altered course, pushing the engines to maximum revolutions, steering into a fog bank that reduced visibility to arm's length. For 6 hours they ran blind, the crew silent, every man listening for the sound of a torpedo slicing through water. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the contact vanished. Steiner allowed himself to believe they had escaped. That night, at 0214 hours, the Rheingold died. The torpedo struck amidships, breaking her keel with a sound like the earth splitting. The explosion sent a column of water and steel fragments 200 feet into the air. Before Steiner could issue an order, a second torpedo hammered into the engine room, and the ship listed violently to port. Men tumbled across tilting decks, clutching for railings that tore from their moorings. The ocean, black and cold as oblivion, rushed in. Steiner made it to a lifeboat with 11 of his crew. They watched Rheingold slide beneath the surface in less than 4 minutes, her lights still burning as she descended, casting an eerie glow that faded into darkness. Then from the fog, a shape emerged, long low water streaming from her deck. A submarine surfaced 100 yards away. On her conning tower, painted in white, was the designation SS-227, and beneath it, the name USS Grouper. An American voice, amplified through a loudspeaker, cut through the night. "You are in international waters, we will report your position. Good luck." Then the submarine dove, her diesels rumbling as she slipped back into the depths, leaving Steiner and his men alone on a raft in the middle of the frozen ocean. They were rescued 4 days later by a neutral Swedish freighter, frostbitten and delirious. By the time Steiner reached Germany, the story of Rheingold had already become legend, whispered in officers' clubs and repeated in hushed tones at naval headquarters. An American submarine, operating alone, thousands of miles from any support, had hunted and killed a German ship in conditions no rational commander would accept. Worse, the submarine had surfaced, identified itself, and departed without fear of retaliation. It was a message written in steel and seawater: nowhere is safe, no route is secure, and we are everywhere.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Grand Admiral Wolff summoned Steiner to Berlin. The meeting took place in a windowless room deep beneath the Tirpitz-Ufer, where the walls were lined with maps marked in red and black. Wolff was a tall man, thin and severe, his face carved by decades at sea. He listened to Steiner's report without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Steiner finished, Wolff stood and walked to the map of the Atlantic. His finger traced the convoy routes, the patrol zones, the areas marked as secure. Then he tapped a spot in the South Atlantic, where Rheingold had died. "How many submarines do the Americans have?" Wolff asked. Steiner hesitated. "Our intelligence estimates perhaps 60 operational boats, Herr Admiral." Wolff shook his head slowly. "Intelligence is wrong, they have more. Far more. And they are not constrained by supply lines, by fuel, by fear. They hunt like we did in 1940, but they do it better." The admission hung in the air like poison. For a German admiral to acknowledge American superiority in any domain was heresy. But Wolff was not a man given to delusion. He had seen the reports, the mounting losses, the convoy routes that now required historical escorts just to survive transit. He had read the interrogation transcripts from captured American submariners, young men barely out of their 20s, who spoke with calm confidence about patrols lasting 70 days, who described living submerged for weeks, who detailed attack procedures so refined they seemed almost mechanical. These were not desperate gamblers. They were professionals, and their professionalism was killing Germany one ship at a time. Wolff ordered a comprehensive review of all merchant and naval losses attributed to submarine action. The results arrived 3 weeks later in a leather-bound folder stamped with the highest security classification. The numbers were staggering. In the first 6 months of 1943, American submarines had sunk or damaged over 200 Axis vessels. In the Pacific, they had effectively severed Japan's supply lines, turning the co-prosperity sphere into isolated islands starving for resources. In the Atlantic, they interdicted blockade runners with such regularity that German captains began refusing assignments to Far Eastern ports. In the Mediterranean, they operated with impunity, sinking transports loaded with troops and equipment destined for North Africa. The submarines themselves were rarely seen. They attacked at night, from periscope depth, using sonar and radar to target ships that never knew they were being stalked. By the time a lookout spotted a periscope wake, the torpedoes were already in the water. The psychological impact was devastating. German sailors, once confident in their mastery of the seas, now sailed in constant fear. Every sonar ping, every shadow beneath the waves, every distant splash could be the prelude to death. Captains took to zigzagging constantly, burning precious fuel in evasive maneuvers that exhausted crews and slowed voyages. Some ships refused to sail at all without destroyer escorts, tying up valuable warships in convoy duty that left them unavailable for offensive operations. Morale crumbled, desertion rates climbed. Men who had volunteered for sea duty now sought transfers to land-based units, preferring the certainty of artillery fire to the invisible menace lurking in the depths. One name began appearing in German naval intelligence reports with disturbing frequency: Commander Richard Holbrook, captain of the USS Barb. Holbrook was not the most decorated American submarine commander, nor did he command the newest boat. But he possessed a quality that terrified the Germans' audacity bordering on madness. Holbrook took Barb into harbors German commanders considered impregnable. He surfaced in broad daylight to shell shore installations with his deck gun. He laid mines in shipping channels, then waited nearby to torpedo the minesweepers sent to clear them. On one legendary patrol, Holbrook took Barb into the Sea of Okhotsk, supposedly a Japanese lake, and sank 14 ships in 3 weeks before casually departing through the same heavily patrolled strait he had entered. When interrogated, a German merchant captain who had survived an encounter with Barb described Holbrook's tactics as those of a pirate who happened to command a modern warship. But Holbrook was not unique. He was simply the most visible example of a new breed of submarine commander the Americans had cultivated. These men were young, aggressive, unbound by the cautious doctrines that had defined naval warfare for centuries. They had been trained not to avoid contact, but to seek it, not to preserve their boats but to use them as weapons that could be risked because more would always be built. The American submarine force operated on a principle that horrified traditionalists: submarines were expendable, but targets were not. If a commander could trade his boat for an enemy cruiser, the exchange was considered favorable. This calculus, cold and brutal, underpinned every patrol, every attack, every decision. By mid-1943, Grand Admiral Wolff had come to a realization that he could not voice publicly, but which consumed his thoughts in the dark hours before dawn. Germany was losing the underwater war, not slowly, not gradually, but catastrophically. The U-boats, once the pride of the Kriegsmarine, were being hunted to extinction by Allied destroyers equipped with advanced sonar and Hedgehog depth charges. The few that survived found their hunting grounds barren, emptied by convoy systems and air cover. Meanwhile, American submarines operated with near impunity, their losses minimal, their kills mounting. The strategic equation had inverted. Germany, which had built its naval strategy around strangling Allied supply lines with submarines, now found its own supply lines strangled by submarines it could neither find nor stop. Wolff proposed a desperate countermeasure: deploy U-boats as submarine hunters. The idea was radical. U-boats were designed to hunt merchant ships and warships on the surface, not other submarines in the depths, but desperation breeds innovation. Wolff handpicked a group of experienced U-boat commanders and tasked them with a single mission: find and destroy American submarines operating in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. The operational plan called for U-boats to lurk near known submarine transit routes, using passive sonar to detect the distinctive acoustic signature of American diesel engines. Once detected, the U-boat would stalk its prey, waiting for the moment when the American boat surfaced to recharge batteries, then strike with torpedoes or gunfire. The operation was a failure before it began. American submarines rarely surfaced in areas where they might be detected. Their sonar was superior, allowing them to hear German U-boats long before they were heard in return. Their operational patterns were unpredictable, guided by intelligence decrypts that gave them advance warning of German ship movements. In 6 months of dedicated anti-submarine patrols, German U-boats successfully engaged exactly one American submarine. The encounter occurred north of the Azores, where U-516, commanded by Korvettenkapitän Hans Grimmer, detected what he believed to be an American boat running submerged at moderate speed. Grimmer maneuvered his boat into attack position and fired a spread of 3 torpedoes. 2 missed. The third struck the target dead center. Grimmer surfaced to confirm the kill and found not an American submarine but a British corvette that had been hunting him. The corvette, badly damaged but still fighting, opened fire with her deck gun. U-516 crash-dived, taking minor damage and escaped. Grimmer returned to base empty-handed and humiliated. The operation was quietly discontinued. The Americans, meanwhile, had perfected the art of the wolf pack in reverse. Where German U-boats had hunted in coordinated groups against convoys, American submarines now operated in loose formations, sharing intelligence and coordinating attacks without ever needing to surface for communication. They used high-frequency radio bursts, transmitted in milliseconds, to relay positions and targets. German direction-finding equipment could detect these bursts but could never triangulate fast enough to pinpoint the transmitting submarine. It was as if the Americans had learned every German tactic, absorbed every innovation, and then improved upon it with industrial efficiency and technological superiority. Commander Steiner, recovered from his ordeal and reassigned to staff duty, found himself analyzing American submarine patrol reports captured from a sunken boat. The reports were chillingly detailed. They included not just tactical information, but operational philosophy. One passage, written by a submarine commander named Walter Griffith of the USS Bowfin, captured the American approach. "We do not seek to survive, we seek to inflict maximum damage. The boat is a tool, the crew is a weapon. Every patrol must justify the resources expended in steel, fuel, and training. If we return with torpedoes remaining, we have failed our mission." Steiner read the passage 3 times, each time feeling a coldness settle deeper into his bones. This was not the philosophy of sailors, this was the creed of executioners. The German naval command struggled to adapt. New listening stations were constructed along occupied coastlines, equipped with hydrophones, sensitive enough to detect a submarine's machinery at 20 miles. Minefields were laid in suspected American transit routes. Fast patrol boats were deployed to hunt contacts reported by acoustic sensors. None of it mattered. The American submarines adapted faster than the Germans could respond. When minefields were laid, the submarines found gaps or simply went deeper than the mines were set. When patrol boats were deployed, the submarines shifted their operating areas. When listening stations reported contacts, the submarines had already moved, leaving only the echo of their passage. By the autumn of 1943, the situation had deteriorated to the point that Admiral Wolff convened a secret conference of senior naval staff at Kiel. The meeting was attended by every available U-boat commander, every admiral with operational experience, and representatives from naval intelligence. The purpose was simple: determine how to counter the American submarine threat. The discussion lasted 3 days and produced no viable solutions. U-boat commanders reported that American submarines were faster, quieter, and better equipped than anything Germany could field. Intelligence officers admitted that American codes remained unbroken, while German codes had been compromised. Technical experts acknowledged that American radar and sonar technology had surpassed German equivalents by a margin that could not be closed within any reasonable time frame. On the final day, Grand Admiral Wolff addressed the assembly. His words were not recorded in any official transcript, but those present never forgot them. He spoke without notes, his voice steady but laden with a weariness that seemed to age him before their eyes. "Gentlemen, we are facing an enemy who has learned from our successes and corrected our failures. They have taken the concept of the submarine, which we perfected, and made it into something we cannot match. They do not have better sailors. They have better tools, better intelligence, and most dangerously, they have the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than we can inflict them. We are fighting a war of attrition we cannot win. The submarine, our greatest weapon, has become our greatest vulnerability, and the Americans are exploiting it with a thoroughness that borders on cruelty." The room fell silent. No one dared respond. To agree was to admit defeat. To disagree was to deny reality. Wolff dismissed the conference without issuing new orders. There was nothing left to order. The German Navy could only continue its missions, knowing that each voyage might end in a sudden explosion, a rush of water, and the cold embrace of the ocean. In the months that followed, the American submarine campaign intensified. Boats like the USS Harder, commanded by the aggressive Samuel Dealey, began targeting not just merchant ships but Japanese destroyers, the very vessels tasked with hunting submarines. Dealey sank 5 destroyers in a single patrol, a feat so audacious that it sent shockwaves through the Imperial Japanese Navy. Other commanders followed his example. The USS Tang, under Richard O'Kane, refined the down-the-throat shot, a tactic where a submarine fired torpedoes directly at an oncoming destroyer, forcing the warship to turn away or be sunk. It was a maneuver that required nerves of steel and perfect timing, and American submariners executed it with increasing regularity. The Germans, reading intelligence reports from their Japanese allies, realized that the Pacific War had become a laboratory where American submarine tactics were tested, perfected, and then applied globally. What worked against Japanese destroyers in the Coral Sea would soon appear in the Mediterranean. What succeeded against blockade runners off Singapore would be used against ore carriers off Norway. The Americans were not fighting separate wars. They were fighting one war with many fronts, and the lessons learned on one front were immediately shared across all others. By 1944, the psychological dominance was complete. German merchant captains would rather brave Allied air attacks than risk submarine-infested water. Naval planners routed convoys hundreds of miles out of their way to avoid areas where American submarines had been reported, even though such reports were often days old and the submarines long gone. The fear was not irrational, it was based on cold mathematics. A merchant ship that encountered an American submarine had less than a 20% chance of survival. Those odds were worse than Russian roulette. The final humiliation came in early 1945 when American submarines began operating in the Baltic Sea itself, the last body of water the Germans considered secure. The USS Swordfish penetrated the heavily mined and patrolled entrance, sank 2 transports evacuating refugees from East Prussia, and escaped without being detected. The audacity of the operation stunned the German naval command. The Baltic was supposed to be a sanctuary, protected by minefields, shore batteries, and constant air patrols. Yet an American submarine had entered, killed, and left as if the defenses did not exist. Grand Admiral Wolff received the report while standing in the same war room where he had first confronted the reality of American submarine superiority. The map on the wall was now almost entirely covered in red pins, each one a German or Japanese loss. Wolff studied the map for a long time, his hands clasped behind his back. Then he turned to his aide, a young officer who had served with him since the beginning of the war. "They are everywhere," Wolff said quietly. "Not because they have infinite numbers, but because we cannot stop them. We built the strategy they are using, we taught the world how to wage war beneath the waves, and now they have taken our lessons and made us obsolete." The aide said nothing. There was nothing to say. The war at sea was over, even if the fighting continued. Germany had been outbuilt, outthought, and outfought by an enemy that had transformed the submarine from a weapon of opportunity into an instrument of total maritime dominance. The American submarines were everywhere, because they could be everywhere, and the Germans who had once ruled the Atlantic, could do nothing but watch their ships die, one by one in waters they no longer controlled. The winter of 1944 brought no mercy, only deeper cuts. Kapitän zur See Friedrich Lauscher commanded the transport Nordland, a former passenger liner converted to carry critical machinery from occupied Norway back to German factories. The voyage should have taken 3 days. Lauscher stretched it to 11, zigzagging through ice fields, hugging coastlines so closely his lookouts could count trees on shore, running only at night with all lights extinguished. His crew thought him paranoid. They were wrong, he was simply educated by fear. On the 12th night, 60 miles from Kiel, Nordland's sonar operator detected a contact. The signature was faint, almost lost in the ambient noise of waves and wind, but it was there, a rhythmic pulse, mechanical, deliberate. Lauscher ordered an immediate course change, pushing the engines to flank speed despite the fuel cost. For 2 hours they ran, the contact growing fainter. Then it vanished entirely. Lauscher allowed himself one moment of relief. It was one moment too many. The torpedo struck at 0347 hours, punching through the hull below the waterline. The explosion tore through the engine room, killing 16 men instantly and flooding 3 compartments. Nordland listed hard to starboard, her propellers thrashing air as the stern rose. Lauscher ordered abandon ship, but half the lifeboats were crushed or inoperable. Men leaped into water so cold it stopped hearts within minutes. Lauscher stayed on the bridge until the deck tilted past 40 degrees, then stepped into the sea. He surfaced gasping, lungs burning, limbs already going numb. Through spray and darkness he saw it, a submarine, sleek and black, rising from the depths like some prehistoric predator. Her conning tower broke the surface first, water cascading off steel plating, then her deck emerged, glistening under a sliver of moon. On her hull painted white against black was the designation SS-311, the USS Archerfish. A hatch opened. An American sailor emerged, followed by another, then an officer. They scanned the wreckage with binoculars, counted lifeboats, noted survivors. The officer raised a megaphone. "You're 4 miles from land, row northeast." Then the submarine's diesels coughed to life, and she slipped back beneath the waves, leaving Lauscher and his men to their fate. 43 of Nordland's crew made it to shore. Lauscher was among them, frostbitten and broken but alive. He filed his report with mechanical precision, describing the attack in clinical detail. The report reached Admiral Wolff within hours. Wolff read it once, set it aside, and picked up another. Then another. The pattern was always the same: detection if they were lucky, a single torpedo if they were not, and the appearance of an American submarine that surfaced to observe its handiwork before vanishing. The Americans were not just sinking ships, they were sending a message. "We see you, we can touch you whenever we choose. And there is nothing you can do to stop us." The Kriegsmarine attempted one final counterstroke. In February 1945, a task force consisting of 2 destroyers and a light cruiser was dispatched to hunt American submarines reported operating off the Danish coast. The force was equipped with the latest sonar, depth charges modified for deeper detonation, and crews trained specifically in anti-submarine warfare. They found nothing. For 8 days they patrolled designated search zones, dropping depth charges on every sonar contact, investigating every suspicious disturbance. They sank 3 schools of fish, 1 whale, and a derelict cargo net. On the 9th day, as they returned to port, the destroyer Klaus Müller detected a genuine contact. Sonar painted a clear picture. A submerged vessel, moving slowly at periscope depth, ranged 1,200 meters. The destroyer swung to attack, depth charges armed, crew at battle stations. Then the contact accelerated. In seconds it went from 6 knots to 20, a speed no German submarine could match. The sonar operator watched in disbelief as the contact dove below 300 meters, deeper than any U-boat could survive, and vanished from his screens. Klaus Müller dropped her depth charges anyway, blanketing the area with explosions that sent columns of water skyward. When the sea settled, there was no debris, no oil slick, no evidence of a kill. The submarine was gone, having played with them like a cat toying with mice before losing interest. The task force returned empty-handed. The commander, Fregattenkapitän Ernst Kohl, submitted a report recommending the discontinuation of anti-submarine patrols. His reasoning was brutal in its honesty. "We are wasting fuel, equipment, and men chasing targets we cannot catch with weapons that cannot reach them. Our sonar is obsolete, our depth charge is inadequate, and our tactics belong to the last war. The Americans have moved beyond us, and we lack the time and resources to catch up." The report was classified and filed. No response was ever issued. Meanwhile, individual acts of desperation became the only German response. U-boat commanders, knowing their boats were obsolete, began taking suicidal risks to achieve any victory against the Americans. Korvettenkapitän Otto Brenner, the same radar operator who had served under Steiner aboard Rinengold, now commanded U-873. He hunted American submarines with a fanaticism that terrified his crew. Brenner studied every known encounter, memorized the acoustic signatures of Gato and Balao class boats, and developed a tactic he called the blind charge. When sonar detected an American submarine, Brenner would dive deep, cut his engines to silent running, and drift with the current, hoping the American would surface or move close enough for a snapshot. It worked exactly once. Off the coast of Iceland, U-873 detected USS Billfish running on the surface at night. Brenner executed his approach perfectly, bringing his boat to within 800 meters without being detected. He fired a spread of 4 torpedoes, then dove deep and ran. 2 torpedoes missed, 1 malfunctioned. The 4th struck Billfish on her port side, flooding her forward torpedo room. The American submarine fought for survival, blowing ballast, reversing engines, her crew battling water that poured through ruptured bulkheads. For 10 minutes, Billfish hung between life and death. Then her pumps gained control, the flooding slowed, and she stabilized. Damaged but afloat, Billfish limped to Reykjavik for repairs. She would return to service 3 months later, and sink 2 more German ships before the war ended. Brenner's victory had cost the Americans nothing but time. U-873 was not so fortunate. The attack had revealed her position. Within hours, Allied destroyers converged on the area. Brenner dove deep, running silent, conserving battery power, hoping to outlast the hunters above. For 3 days he played the game, slipping through sonar nets, evading depth charge patterns, surfacing only at night for precious minutes to recharge batteries and refresh air. On the 4th day, his luck expired. A British destroyer detected U-873 at dawn, her silhouette visible against the lightening sky. Depth charges rained down, each explosion closer than the last. The pressure hull groaned, rivets popped, lights shattered. Brenner surfaced to surrender. His crew evacuated, climbing onto the deck with hands raised. The British destroyer closed to pick them up. As the last man cleared the hatch, U-873 slipped beneath the waves, scuttled by charges Brenner had set before abandoning her. She took no Americans with her, only the pride of a man who had tried to match an enemy beyond his reach. Stories like Brenner's became legend among the dwindling ranks of German submariners, not because they inspired hope, but because they illustrated futility. Every German success was isolated, purchased at enormous cost, and ultimately meaningless against the tide of American production and technological superiority. For every American submarine damaged, 3 more arrived in theater. For every German U-boat that survived a patrol, 2 were lost. The mathematics were unforgiving. By April 1945, Grand Admiral Wolff was no longer planning operations. He was planning evacuations. The Red Army had reached the Oder River. Allied bombers flew unopposed over German cities. The surface fleet had been reduced to a handful of ships hiding in Norwegian fjords. The U-boat force, once 500 strong, numbered fewer than 50 operational boats. And the American submarines continued their work with methodical efficiency, sinking the last trickles of German maritime trade, intercepting refugee ships, closing every exit. Wolff's final meeting with surviving senior officers took place in a bunker outside Hamburg. The men who attended were hollow-eyed and silent. There was no discussion of tactics or strategy. Instead, Wolff spoke of legacy. He stood before a map that had once shown German dominance, and now showed only red pins marking loss. "The Americans did not defeat us with superior courage," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "They defeated us with superior thinking. We believed the submarine was a weapon of attrition, a tool to bleed our enemies slowly. They understood it as an instrument of total war, to be used without restraint, without mercy, and above all without fear of loss. We husbanded our U-boats, conserving them for another patrol, another day. They expended their submarines like ammunition, knowing more would come. We fought to preserve what we had. They fought to destroy what we had. That is why they won." He paused, looking at each man in turn. "You will be asked in the years to come how we lost control of the seas. Tell them the truth. We did not lose it to better ships or braver men. We lost it to a nation that understood war better than we did. The Americans turned our own doctrine against us, improved it, and applied it with industrial ruthlessness. We taught them how to hunt. They taught us what it means to be prey." The meeting ended. Within weeks, Germany surrendered. The U-boat force received orders to surface, fly black flags, and proceed to Allied ports for internment. Most complied. A few scuttled themselves rather than face capture. Admiral Wolff was taken into custody by British forces. He spent 2 years in detention, then retired to a small village in Bavaria, where he lived quietly until his death in 1963. He never spoke publicly about the war, never wrote memoirs, never granted interviews. Those who knew him said he spent his final years walking the hills, staring at the horizon, perhaps searching for a sea he no longer recognized. Commander Steiner survived the war and became a maritime historian. He wrote extensively about submarine warfare, always returning to a central thesis: the submarine had been Germany's greatest weapon until it became America's. In his final book, published shortly before his death in 1978, he included a passage that captured the essence of what had happened. "We believed we were wolves," he wrote. "We prowled the oceans, striking from darkness, vanishing into depths. We were proud of our cunning, our ruthlessness, our kills, but the Americans showed us we were never wolves. We were sheep who had learned to bare our teeth, and when the true wolves came, we could only bleat in terror as they tore us apart." The legacy of the American submarine campaign was written not in celebrations but in silence. The submarines themselves were mostly scrapped after the war, cut apart and melted down. Their commanders returned to civilian life, some famous, most forgotten. The tactics they developed became doctrine, studied in naval academies worldwide, but the deeper legacy was psychological. The Americans had taken a weapon the Germans had perfected and used it to demonstrate that technological superiority and industrial capacity could overcome any advantage of experience or skill. They had shown that in modern war the side that learns faster, adapts quicker, and produces more will prevail regardless of initial disadvantages. For Germany, the lesson was bitter. The nation that had pioneered submarine warfare, that had nearly starved Britain into submission, that had turned the Atlantic into a killing ground, had been defeated by its own creation. The U-boats, symbols of German ingenuity and aggression, had become symbols of obsolescence and failure. The Americans had not simply beaten Germany at its own game, they had changed the rules of the game entirely, rendering German expertise irrelevant. In the decades that followed, veterans on both sides occasionally met at naval reunions and conferences. The conversations were polite, formal, tinged with the uncomfortable awareness that they had tried to kill each other. One such meeting occurred in 1969, when Jacob Steiner encountered Richard Holbrooke, the former commander of USS Barb, at a symposium in London. They spoke briefly, two old men, far from the sea. Steiner asked Holbrooke if he had ever felt fear during his patrols. Holbrooke considered the question, then answered honestly. "Every day," he said. "Every single day, but we had something you didn't. We knew that if we died, 10 more boats would take our place. That knowledge made us bold." Steiner nodded slowly. "That knowledge made you invincible," he replied. The American submarine campaign had been more than a military operation. It had been a statement of industrial and intellectual dominance, a demonstration that the future of warfare belonged to nations that could learn, adapt, and produce at scales their enemies could not match. The submarines themselves were merely tools. The true weapon had been the American capacity to absorb defeat, study failure, and emerge stronger. Germany had started the underwater war with every advantage: experience, training, proven designs, established tactics. America had started with nothing but potential. By the end, potential had crushed experience, and the ocean that Germany had once ruled belonged to an enemy that had learned its lessons too well. The final word belongs not to admirals or historians, but to an unnamed German sailor whose diary was recovered from a lifeboat found drifting off Norway in May 1945. His ship had been sunk days earlier. He had written one last entry before succumbing to exposure. "We never saw them," he wrote. "We only heard the explosion, felt the ship break, watched the water rise. They were ghosts, everywhere and nowhere. We sailed in fear, knowing each horizon might hide our death. This is what we did to others in 1940. This is what was done to us in return. The sea remembers, and the sea does not forgive." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.